Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 161 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Joining me today is Constance Huff. She retired from the U.S. Army as a Chief Warrant Officer 4. Connie spent more than 24 years in Army intelligence, holding 3 occupational specialties: interrogator, CI special agent, and case officer. She spent the majority of her career in counterintelligence, where she specialized in counter-espionage investigations and operations. Connie was a senior instructor for the U.S. Army's Advanced Foreign Counterintelligence Training Course, which was a 15-week course where journeyman-level special agents were taught advanced investigation skills, physical surveillance, and offensive CI operations. Connie was named as the Department of Defense's Investigator of the Year in 1992. She earned a master's degree in education from Boston University and is currently a senior instructor with CTCI Training Partners, which provides training to public and private organizations on counterterrorism and counterintelligence matters. I invited Connie onto the podcast to discuss one of the highlights of her career. On the eve of Operation Desert Storm, she and her team investigated Specialist 4 Albert Sombolay after learning he'd approached several foreign embassies offering information on the U.S. Army's plans and movements in Kuwait, as well as their chemical warfare capabilities. Connie and her team pulled off a successful investigation that resulted in a long prison sentence for a traitor inside the U.S. Army. But before we get into that story, I want to thank all of my patrons over at patreon.com, including Joshua B. and Michael D. If you're interested in supporting this program and all my other efforts, you can subscribe to my page at patreon.com. My patrons get exclusive access to long-form blog posts that dive deep into some of the most amazing stories in the history of espionage, and receive free or discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. That includes a free PDF copy of my own book, Spy Shots Volume 1, 101 True Tales from the World of Espionage. You can also listen to some of my exclusive podcast episodes where I review films and TV series from the espionage genre. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode to see some of my free articles there and sign up for more exclusive content as well. Connie, thank you for coming on to the show.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Justin. It's a real honor to be here.
I appreciate it, and I feel the same way as well. Honor talking to you. So I first heard about this story directly from you, as a matter of fact, a year or two ago, when you spoke about it with Gina Osborne, who I believe is a longtime friend and, I guess, former coworker of yours. And I knew that my own listeners would want to hear about it as well, so I'm really happy that we were able to get in touch after that.
Oh, great. Yeah, Gina and I have been friends since the Sombolay investigation. And after she left the Army, she went on to a wonderful career in the FBI. Yeah, she's my chosen sister.
Oh, fantastic. And you met on this case, then. That's very cool.
We did. Yep.
So I mentioned that you clearly had a very long career with the Army specifically, which is something that we have not talked about a whole lot in the past. As a matter of fact, usually it's FBI or CIA, occasionally the Army, but not that often. So can you talk a little bit about what led you to a career in military counterintelligence in the first place?
Certainly. I started out as an interrogator, or what today is called human intelligence collectors, or HICS. And my first language from the Defense Language Institute was Serbo-Croatian. So I got to Munich in May of 1976, and my boss said he had some good news and some bad news. And the good news was I, at the time, was a private first class, and he said, you're wearing civilian clothes, you live in an apartment, how much better, and you're in Munich, Germany, how much better could that get? And I said, well, it's great so far. So what's the bad news? He says, well, we don't really have anybody who comes out of Yugoslavia with much intelligence value, so you probably won't have much to do as an interrogator. And he was right. I got to do one biographical debriefing of a refugee with a native speaker, and he didn't have any information, so we let him go. And the 18 months I was assigned to the United States Army Europe's interrogation center. We didn't have anybody else come through. So I got to learn a
Oh,
lot
no.
about source operations and editing other people's reports. But the writing was on the wall that if I wanted to do something different, I needed to get a different language. I got reassigned to the old 165th MI battalion in Frankfurt when it was still part of the 66th MI group. And there they needed a German interrogator. And of course, I didn't go to German. So they wanted to know if I'd like to learn to do physical surveillance. And I said, well, sure. So I was the first woman trained in physical surveillance against the old Soviet military liaison mission. And I think you had Aidan McGee on your show not long ago talking about his book about the history of the Smela missions. And back then, our sole focus was on the Soviet military liaison mission. So that was my first entree into counterintelligence. And I just loved it. I had two nicknames. One was Get a Commie for Christ Connie because of my enthusiasm. And I was young and dumb, and I'd lie beside the Autobahn with a tarp over me just to call a smelling plate by.
Oh, my gosh.
And yeah, the other one was Park Plots Queen because I had to go to the bathroom a lot. And the guys, at the time, I was the only woman on the team, and they would say, she's in and out of the car before we ever even stop, and she's ready to go again. So I loved it. And from that assignment, I decided not only was I going to stay in the Army, but I wanted to be a counterintelligence special agent. So I went through the special agent course in 79, graduating in January of 80, and then right back to Germany. And I cut my teeth during that assignment doing personnel security investigations. That's when we actually did them for the Army. I did operational security covering agent duties for nuclear missile sites in our area of operation and for a Chinook helicopter unit that actually rotated nuclear warheads, did a lot of threat briefings. Back then we called SAIDA, Subversion and Espionage Directed Against the Army. I think they've changed acronyms now, but we took a lot of suspicious reports to see if they were going to turn out to be, some sort of threat against the military. And I augmented the Smela mission on weekends or when there was a surge capacity needed because I was in a different unit at the time. So I still got to do some of that. But that was my initial assignment in counterintelligence was in Mainz, Germany.
My gosh. It sounds like you stayed very, very busy once you switched over from the human intelligence.
Oh, I loved it. Yeah, from interrogation, absolutely. And then I got to Fort Meade and I did cover support for military intelligence units. I was asked to go to the case officer course. So I went through what was then called the military operations training course. And once I graduated from there, I was required to do a 1 year assignment under that specialty. And my assignment ended up working with special mission units. Everybody's heard of Delta and SEAL Team 6 since Abbottabad. Well, there were many more that existed back in the 80s, and they probably still do today. But I got to work from a higher headquarters level with the actual CI agents assigned to specific units, and they would come to us and we would help them design military and commercial covers for organizations and individuals and do operational security evaluations for them. Then I went to language school for Italian and was sent to Vicenza, Italy. And I was the chief of the espionage section and later took over the PSI mission as well. Did that for 3 years and then went back to the 66 MI group headquarters where I was operations officer for the sub-control office. And we controlled all espionage investigations for the United States Army Europe. And during that assignment, it was decided that a special investigations team would be created under Det 15. And there were some territorial issues between another battalion and the Det 15. And so this went on for about a year. And then finally, in December of 1990, we got the lead on Sombolay. And Lieutenant Colonel James Bonas, who was in charge of the CI division at the group, called me in and he said, Connie, you're no longer the ops officer. You just started the SIT, and here's your first investigation. And so that led me to be a team chief for one of the special investigations teams. And I did that until 1993 when I came back to Fort Meade and became an instructor and later senior instructor at the Army's Advanced Foreign Counterintelligence Training course, which after I retired would start becoming more purple, and it morphed into what is now called the Joint CI Training Academy, or JCETA. Although I was never assigned there, our 15-week long program was the foundation for the birth of JCETA and all the different courses that they now offer. So I was glad to be part of AVCITIC.
Sounds
And
like
then
you
I
were just at the
retired.
center of every storm.
Well, then I retired, and retirement's not all it was cracked up to be. So after 2 months, I started working as an instructor for a private company called the Center for Counterintelligence and Security Studies, run by David Major and his then partner, Rusty Capps. And I worked for that company from August of 99 until December of 2011, and became their vice president for training and education, as well as one of their lead instructors for counterintelligence and counterterrorism. And then in 2013, I started working for the CTCI Training Partners, which Rusty Capps formed in 2009 and owns. And this year I became his chief operating officer, as well as one of the lead instructors for counterintelligence and counterterrorism courses.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. When I went to the site the other day, I noticed that your bio was at the very top right there with Rusty. So I was wondering if you had founded it with him or something like that, but sounds like you were integral to the company.
Well, I like to think so, but no, he formed it without me. But as soon as my non-compete was over, he hired me. So,
Oh, gotcha.
yeah. So,
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, it sounds like you have a whole lot of experience to draw on as an instructor now.
oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. And teaching, I teach online now for the government, which has been nice, especially during COVID. Yeah, so it's good. Keeps me busy and involved in, not just history but current issues as well.
Totally understand that. So we mentioned Sombolay, of course, who's kind of the
hmm
subject of this discussion entirely. So he
hmm
came up on your radar in 1990, you said, and he was in Germany. He was assigned to Germany at that time, so he was right in your area of operations or your area of responsibility.
Yes, he was assigned to a field artillery battalion under the 8th Infantry Division in Baumholder, Germany, as a 13 Bravo, which was the military occupational specialty code. He was a cannoneer, and he was due to deploy to Desert Shield / Desert Storm at the end of December. And I think we got the lead on the 10th of December. So we had like 21 days to start the investigation and figure out how to keep him from deploying with his unit to the war so we could continue to investigate him without alerting him to the fact that he was under investigation.
Hmm.
So that was one of the first challenges that we had. And his unit solved that problem. While I was a case agent the entire time, one of my first partners, and his name is Greg, and he's still in government service, so I won't use his last name because of he might be doing something sensitive. But he and I worked the first 6 weeks, 7 weeks or so. We went to the unit and said, this guy is no doubt he has contacted the Jordanian embassy in Brussels, Belgium, and has sold him some of your unclassified movement orders. And we've got a priority one investigation. We don't want him to deploy, so we can continue to investigate him. What's your suggestion? And the sergeant major said, that's easy. He said, we've got 5 flights out to Kuwait, and we'll just put him on the last flight out. But soldiers have to show up for every flight movement. And so he will see that because of some emergency or the plane being overweight, 1, 2, 5 people will be called off. So by the time he's supposed to get on a plane at the end of December, he will have seen other people left behind in the rear detachment, and he, along with 2 or 3 others, whatever we think is necessary to mask the fact that he's under investigation, he just won't get on the plane. And then he'll be assigned to the rear detachment and bomb holder, and you can continue your investigation, and we don't have to worry about that insider threat while we're deployed. So the unit solved that problem for us.
Wow, wow. Is that surprising to you that they were clearly headed off to war and they were not only willing to totally cooperate but leave several people behind in Germany? I mean, was that like an unexpected level of cooperation, or is that pretty normal in your experience?
Well, in my experience, I think it's normal when you've got the senior leadership and you brief them that they've got an insider betraying them. They want that person neutralized in the most expedient way possible without endangering other soldiers' lives. And the fact that they were actually deploying to the war just put another element of, I don't want to say importance, but urgency on it to allow us to investigate them, but to still protect the men who were deploying, from him going with them. So yeah, it didn't surprise me that the sergeant major and the battalion commander were, that responsive. And I will tell you, from the time we started this December 10th, and Greg and I were probably briefing them on December 12th, until we actually arrested Sombolay on the 29th, no one in his unit other than the sergeant major and the battalion commander, the division commander, and a captain who was in charge of the rear detachment who stayed behind to keep those soldiers who had to stay and could not deploy. A man by the name of Captain Flood. Those were the only ones that knew he was under investigation, and none of it ever leaked.
Terrific. Terrific. So he was perfectly happy not to go, or should I say content, didn't cause a stir or anything like that?
No, in fact, we asked that question, and the sergeant major said he may protest along with a couple of others because, oh, I really want to go to war and I want to show Saddam, and all that kind of rhetoric. But he said secretly, anybody who doesn't get on that plane will be relieved because they're not putting their life in danger. They just will have that bravado for the other soldiers and kind of be disappointed, but secretly happy.
Gotcha.
So,
Gotcha.
yeah.
So after this information comes in, was that the main time sensitive factor right there, trying to make sure that he didn't actually deploy at the end of the month? That were you able to like take your time and do the investigation right, so to speak, after that, or was there continued urgency because of the war?
Well, since the threat he posed to his unit was truly neutralized by us keeping him there, the investigation could proceed at a normal fashion. I don't know what would have happened if he had had to deploy and somebody, in theater in Kuwait would have taken over the investigation. It would have been very difficult to, do.
I'll bet.
So I would say at that point, we continued at a good clip because we arrested him in, I think, 110 days from the date of the allegation until the date of his arrest, which is a really fast resolution on an espionage case. So,
Okay. Yeah, that certainly makes sense. So once he's back there, do you start like? Well, first of all, I should go back. Was he identified by name when this information first came to you? Was there was no question as to who was the actual subject or the potential subject of the investigation?
yeah, there was no question who it was. I can't tell you to this day how we got the information, but it was very specific. And as soon as we ran his name and found out he was a soldier and not an airman, we knew then the Army had investigative jurisdiction. But yeah, so Greg and I then went to Baumholder the very next day and started our investigation there, briefing, like I said, his sergeant major and his battalion commander. We did all the records checks. We found out that he was a naturalized U.S. citizen, originally born in Zaire. He'd become naturalized in 1988. He had married an American woman, and she lived with him and was a aide at the school making minimum wage. According to his records, he spoke French and English, although a couple of people, according to the sergeant major, thought he might speak Arabic, and that would become important later when we actually did the undercover operation, but it was not in his records, so we didn't know. He was pretty old. He was 39 and it was an E4. He had been a sergeant E5 and had been busted down to E4 because of bad check writing. He had enlisted at age 34, so he was a lot older than what you normally see in your junior enlisted men and women. And from that standpoint, he was kind of a loner because of his age. He didn't fit in with the 19, 20, 23, 24 year olds, and because he was an E4, even though he's 39, he didn't fit in with the senior NCOs. So one of the things we had thought about was trying to recruit somebody that he was friends with, use him as a confidential source, but he didn't really have any friends in
Oh,
his unit. So
gosh.
yeah, we had to we had to can that idea. Yeah. So and then we found out, of course, you're looking at his records. He did not have a clearance, but that is not important in the military for the crime of espionage. It's national defense information, and it's not specific to whether it's got to be classified or not. Now, the FBI requires it to be classified information, but all the military services, the Navy, who investigates for the Marines as well, the Air Force and the Army, all know under the Uniform Code of Military Justice that if they sell national defense information to a foreign adversary, it falls under the Article 106 espionage in the Uniform Code of Justice or Military Justice. So we knew we were going to be able to charge him with that, assuming we could collect more evidence than the classified source that gave us the information, because we couldn't use that at trial. So that was
Right.
one of the conditions. You can use it to investigate, but the source, sources and methods have to be protected, and we'd never be able to disclose that. So we went in with that understanding.
Gotcha. Yeah, that seems to be a complication from all of the stories that I've read and covered here, and that sort of thing is oftentimes it's very difficult to, prove something beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law versus what is actually what is factually known about a case and what you can present and all that can be two very different things, unfortunately. So you had to essentially get him to commit espionage again. Then is that correct?
Well, in fact, yeah, when we get to the part about the arrest, we actually charge him with Article 106A, which is the attempted espionage.
Ah,
And that was the two meetings he had with the undercover agent. So we had the two acts of espionage that we knew about, but couldn't use the source, in trial, but we did have the attempted espionage there as well. So,
I see. I
yeah.
see. And earlier you mentioned it was unclassified unit movement information. So he went and told a foreign government that I assume like my unit is going to Kuwait in at the end of December or something like that.
Yep, he approached the Jordanian embassy in Brussels, Belgium, and sold them information about the movement of his field artillery battalion. And he also gave them some unclassified nuclear, biological, and chemical equipment. And believe it or not, some meals ready to eat.
Oh my gosh.
God only knows why he brought those, but we would not know how much he got paid until during the sting operation when he was talking to the undercover officer. And the Jordanians had paid him in American currency roughly $1,400 between two contacts they had with them.
Hmm.
So, and that was enough to whet his appetite and make him think that, you know, he could continue with them. But going to war was going to be a bit of an issue. So he had told them that he would be willing, if they gave him a video camera, once he deployed, he would take videos of what his unit was doing if they could figure a way for him to be able to get the videotape to them. So yeah, he had a lot of damage planned out. It's just that we were able to intervene and keep him from really doing any more damage than he had already done.
Hmm. That really is incredible because there's so many stories, of course, of people passing sensitive information to our adversaries, but it's not often that it's a case like this where it's his fellow soldiers in his barracks, in his formation, all that he's putting in danger. Like people he knows personally are at an
Exactly.
increased level of danger because of what he's doing for $1,400.
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh my gosh. So pretty despicable under any circumstances, but especially these. So was this was purely about money? Did he have some sort of grievance with his unit or with America, anything like that?
Yeah, we wouldn't know his motivations until after he was arrested and he invoked his rights. So we had to wait until his lawyers and he decided whether or not he was going to plead guilty or go to trial and, under a court martial and try to disprove the evidence against him. But let's see, we arrested him on the 29th of March, and it wasn't until I think the 12th or 13th of July of 91, while he is in confinement in Mannheim, that his lawyers would come to the government prosecutors, two captains, and tell them that he wanted to waive his Article 32 hearing, which is kind of the equivalent of a grand jury in a civilian world. And he elected judge only. And we had charged him the night of his arrest with Article 104, aiding the enemy, Article 106 Alpha, espionage and attempted espionage. And we'd also charged him with 5 aggravating offenses: Article 92, failure to obey lawful order regulation; Article 108, selling government property to an unauthorized individual; Article 121, larceny under $100. Our physical surveillance team, the one that Gina Osborne was working on, saw him shoplift what appeared to be perfume out of the PX. And then he went over to a German repair shop where one of his clunker cars were being repaired. And they saw him give this guy the same box they had seen him take out of the PX. So we charged him with larceny under $100. I mentioned he had been busted for writing bad checks. Well, he was on the bad check writing list, but he was still able to cash bad checks. So we charged him with Article 124, uttering worthless checks. And then at the sting operation, he grabbed an expired dependent's ID card out of a desk in the office where he'd been working while he was in rear detachment, and he gave that to our undercover. So we charged him with Article 134, which was giving an ID card to an unauthorized individual. So the 12th or 13th of July, that's when his lawyers came in and said to the prosecutors, he's willing to plead guilty to Article 104, aiding the enemy, and Article 106A, espionage and attempted espionage, if you will drop the aggravating offenses. And
Well,
we couldn't have been more surprised. And they were willing to take 20 years. Well, through working with the prosecutors, they, of course, knew we wanted to do CID briefings and polygraphs. And so they countered and said, okay, we'll accept the UCMJ charges and we'll give you 19 years instead of 20 if Sombolay will agree to CID briefings and polygraphs. And that's what he agreed to. The deal was sealed. The judge won't see it until after he sentences Albert. And then after he sentenced Albert, he would open it up and see that what the deal was. And so essentially that 19 years was like an umbrella, as the lawyers described it to me. If he got anything over 19 years and he didn't have a plea agreement, he'd have to work it off. But with a plea agreement, if he got anything over 19, as long as he cooperated with CID briefings and polygraphs, he worked off the 19 years. But if he ever broke his deal and we could prove he was breaking his deal, he got a 34-year sentence. Then the 34 years would have kicked in. So it's kind of a safety net for him. But our lawyers were really surprised because their senior JAG officers had said, oh, you might get 3 to 5 years since he didn't pass anything classified. And he ended up getting 34 years, a dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and reduction to E1. And then, as I said, the plea agreement was 19 years, CID and polygraphs, and the dishonorable discharge, the forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and the reduction to E1 also transferred to the plea agreement because under the rules of military court martial, a soldier in the grade of E1 to E9 receives a dishonorable discharge, they're automatically reduced to E1. So that's how his sentence fell out.
Okay, that's very
and that's when we
interesting.
well, that's how we found out his motivations. And that's what started this. Was we would not know until after all this was over. The judge found him guilty, sentenced him, and then we have to start debriefing him at Mannheim Confinement Facility. And that's when we found out what his real motivations were. And the first thing that he told my boss was a GS 14 or 15 by the name of Maceo Boston, who had been a counterintelligence special agent and retired as a warrant officer and was a technical surveillance countermeasures expert. And he was my immediate boss. Well, he decided he wanted to help me with the first debriefing. And that first day, Sombolay told us, and I wrote this down, I'll rewrite history. My story can be called The Spy Who Went Broke. And we said, what are you talking about? He said, well, all I got was $1,400. And you guys are going to get pats on the back and you'll probably get some kind of award. And what did I get? And it was crazy. And we're kind of looking at each other. I said, Albert, you got justice. You tried to sell out your country. And he was so fixated on that. I will tell you, during the sting, he actually received about 3,000 marks from our undercover.
Mm-hmm.
And after he was arrested, he had his wife file through the lawyers to get that 3,000 marks back because, as far as he was concerned, it was his money. And we had to explain to him, no, Albert, it was our money. We took pictures, Xerox copies of it as evidence. It was never your money. But yeah, so he was very disappointed that he ended up in jail.
Yeah, he's the real victim in this story.
Absolutely. Yeah. And his motivations when it comes to need and greed, I mentioned that his pay had been garnished. He was in debt. Collectors had come against him. And that's why his pay was being garnished, except for a very small amount. He was lucky he lived in military quarters. Our physical surveillance team saw him spending lots of money. And he would later tell us that he knew that when he traveled to Brussels and would meet with his Zairean friends, because there's an area, I think it's called Excels, and I don't speak French or Flemish, or not Flemish, what do they speak in Belgium? Whatever other language it is. But anyway, I think it's called the Excels area. He would go there on weekends and sometimes just overnight because it was about a 4-hour trip. And he wanted to be the big man and he was spending money he didn't have. And he saw the Gulf War as an opportunity to make money. Something else I think factored into his motivations when it came to the need and greed. He grew up in Africa in a very poor family. And so he came from a bartering society. So I think he looked at, I've got some information. Who can I go to? Because we're getting ready to go to war that, might value it and give me some money. So for him, I think it was just part of his culture. And then you ask if he was angry at anything. Certainly he was disgruntled and wanted some revenge because he thought he should have been made an officer when he enlisted. I mentioned he was 34 years old. Well, he had a degree from an unaccredited college in Zaire, which the Army didn't recognize. So all they could do was bringing him in as an enlisted soldier. And so that bothered him. And it just goes back into his ego, thinking he had more potential than the Army recognized. In fact, when our search team searched his home after he was arrested, they found documents that revealed he was planning to overthrow the Zairean government and put himself and his relatives in positions of power.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, they found another document. I think it was called the Merchants Bank that we all used in Germany at the time. And he had tried to swindle a Belgian bank out of $10,000. And so we asked him about that when we're able, obviously to talk to him after he's been sentenced. And he said, oh, that. He said, well, I pretended to be an army captain from Greece when I went to Belgium. And I went to this bank and said I wanted to borrow $10,000 to open a disco. And he said, I even carried a bottle of ouzo because they drink that in Greece. And I was like, okay. And he said, but the Belgian bank said I had to show that I had $10,000 in the bank. So he went home and got a bank statement, put a clean piece of paper over the text of it, Xeroxed it, and then tried to type a statement reflecting that he had $10,000. We just arrested him before he could try to scam the bank.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
yeah, so he had a lot of things going on. And the psychological assessment of Sombolay, when you try to understand these motivations, and to me, people are unique and we're as complex and complicated as the next person. But our psychological tests of him after he had been sentenced and he agreed to undergo these tests was that he was on the lower IQ side, that he was a borderline pathological liar, that he distorted reality. And I asked the psychologist what that meant. And he said, well, think of it as going through life on one roller skate and the other foot is in the air, and how everything around you kind of moves and is, off kilter. He says that's the way Albert sees his life. And if he believes something to be true, unless you prove it otherwise, he's going to stick to that story. Well, when we were debriefing him several times, when we would confront him with something, he would say, that's my story unless you show me otherwise, because he was really annoyed that we didn't have to present any evidence at trial. And I said, well, you pled guilty. We don't have to. And well, that's not fair. And I said, well, you should have talked to your lawyers about that. But yeah, so that distortion of the reality and the fact that he was a borderline pathological liar, the psychologist also said he would probably have difficulty passing polygraphs, and he never did pass a polygraph. So yeah, but yeah, so that's a little bit on his motivations.
Oh wow. What a complex and interesting individual, but also what a total lowlife. I mean, he's so despicable. I can't believe it.
You know what I say about traitors, Justin? I say, I'm a hang 'em high, bury 'em deep when it comes to betraying our country.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
just ice water in his veins. It sounds like the minute he gets something he thinks is of value to America's enemies, he's like, yeah, let me see if I can make a few bucks on this and live the high life
Yep.
for a weekend in Belgium or something. And that's
Yeah,
all
well,
he's
he
concerned about.
volunteered to Maceo and me that first day. That he said, if I had not been arrested, I was going to find younger soldiers who had clearances and try to get them to work with me. And they would give me the classified information. I would sell it, and then I would give them a cut of it. So he had already kind of planned out how he was going to commit espionage if either the Jordanians or the Iraqis actually tried to have a relationship with him. And he also told us that if he had had a clearance, anything in the safe would have been gone. So thank God he didn't have a clearance.
Oh
And thank
gosh.
God we intervened before he could recruit other soldiers who might be having problems,
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Hopefully, other soldiers would have the sense to know that this 39-year-old E4 is leading them down a bad path. But I guess you never know.
You never know. There, look at the Clyde Conrad case and who
Right. Right.
he
Right.
recruited.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't recall. He had a bunch. I'm sure you know more about that case than I do, but he had like a dozen people working with him at one point or something like that, wasn't it?
Let's see, Jeffrey Rondeau. Oh, I can see their faces, and right now I can't think of their names.
Oh, that
There
was a
was a
big one for you as
female.
well, huh? Okay.
No, I didn't work it. I just teach
Oh,
that class, but I
oh, I
haven't
see. I
taught it
see.
in a while. And I know people who work the investigation. And there's a book out called Traitors Among Us by Stu Harrington, who is the commander of the unit. And he talks about that case as well as one with James Hall. But I think Conrad had 5 subordinate spies, and they were all younger enlisted soldiers. So, yeah, because once he retired, he needed access. Well,
Hmm.
Sombolay didn't have access and knew he needed access. So he was going to look for people with problems.
Right, right. That's
Yeah. So.
understandable at least. I wouldn't say smart, but understandable at least.
Yeah.
So Connie, we kind of jumped to the end in a sense, and I
Uh-huh.
think everybody came into this knowing he went to jail. But I want to go back. You did mention a couple of times that you used an undercover agent or
Hmm.
operative or whatever against him. So, at what point in the investigation did you decide that that was the best route to go? And then how did you perform?
Okay. Well, one of the things, if you've never been involved in an espionage investigation, is that they're inherently complex. We're always planning, evaluating, redirecting, reevaluating the information. We've got to have a lot of flexibility. And we have intrusive techniques like physical surveillance, technical surveillance, when you put in listening devices, or in today's world, following the cars or whatever through technical means. And then the non intrusive techniques are just your basic interviews, record checks, with the DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles in the
Hmm.
Army, whatever it was called, his personnel records. We couldn't talk to we didn't talk to any of his soldiers that he served with, other than, as I mentioned, the sergeant major, the battalion commander, and his first sergeant, and then Captain Flood. So we never went down to the level where he worked on a daily basis. So we did those non-intrusive techniques, and again, one of the things we were trying to do, and instead of just getting a feel for who he was, has he got anybody we could recruit and run as a confidential source against him, and maybe get that person to be recruited, and that could bring in some evidence. Well, it was, as I mentioned, very clear he's a loner and older, so that wasn't going to work. So we started thinking about a sting probably in the mid-January, as Greg and I are doing all these checks. And then the 1st of February, we had physical surveillance on him, and what we were looking at then were to establish the patterns, his activities, behavior, and contacts. And we were looking for some predictability. I had mentioned he had contacted the Jordanians at their embassy in Brussels. Well, when we first talked to the unit, they said that can't be. Our soldiers have been under a restricted movement since before Thanksgiving, and that's way out of where he could go. And I said, well, trust me, he went, and we know he went. And so they were like, well, they're just kind of incredulous, if you will, that he would actually break that particular order. Well,
Hmm.
he went there. He would later tell us, because there's low to no U.S. presence in Brussels, and he felt very safe there. But one of our surveillance goals was to find out when he was going, what he was doing there, who he was contacted, that type of thing. But we were not allowed to follow him into Belgium. We had to coordinate with the 650th MI group, which is a NATO organization in Mons, Belgium. We had to coordinate with the CIA in Germany. Back then it was in Bonn, as well as they had to contact CIA station in Brussels. And Brussels came back and said, the surveillance team can't cross the German-Belgian border, even in hot pursuit, because there's some issues going on with the Belgian counterintelligence service. So our surveillance team was very frustrated. They would follow him from Baumholder, Germany, to the Belgian border. He would cross. They would have to sit up at night, all night long on the border, wait for him to come back the next day or that night, and then follow him back to Baumholder. So we had no idea what he was doing. And as I mentioned, he would sometimes leave on a Friday and wouldn't come back till Sunday. Other times, say he'd go on a Tuesday and come back Wednesday morning. So that was a big question from the 1st of February until we arrested him, was what's he doing in Belgium? And we would not find that out until we were able to later, debrief him after he'd been sentenced. So we decided that a sting was going to be the best fit for trying to neutralize them. And the military has a rich history of sting operations, or technically what's called a false flag operation. But one of the unique things about this particular sting is it was the Army's first all Army sting, meaning we did not use an FBI undercover officer. Up until that point in 1991, all the stings that we'd been involved in, we had used an undercover FBI agent, and we had asked the FBI to support this operation. The legal attaché out of the embassy in Bonn contacted the FBI, contacted headquarters. They agreed to do it. And then about 2 weeks before this was supposed to go down in March, the FBI agent at the embassy got in touch with us and said, headquarters wants to make sure he's passed classified or higher. And I said, well, no, as far as we know, he hasn't. He doesn't have a clearance. Now, does that mean he hasn't got his hands on some? I don't know, but I can tell you he doesn't have a clearance. And he said, okay, I'll get back with you. Well, he got back with us and said they didn't want to support it because classified wasn't involved. So we went through the UCMJ and he said, it's not going to matter. That's just the FBI's policy. So very quickly, we had to find a new undercover, and I can't disclose his name, but he was an Army case officer. He was a native of the Middle East.
Before we go on, I want to tell you all about a new podcast from Tenderfoot TV called To Die For. Imagine you were a fly on the wall at a dinner between the Mafia, the CIA, and the KGB. That's where this unprecedented podcast begins. Brought to you by the makers of the hit podcast To Live and Die in LA, To Die For marks the first time a Russian-trained honey trap has told her story from beginning to end. Taught to seduce men for their secrets and sometimes their lives, Alia Rosa was trained to believe that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the state. She was meticulously trained to be the perfect weapon, able to seduce her targets into compromising situations that have ended careers and sometimes lives. From Tenderfoot TV, the studio that brought you Up and Vanished, and To Live and Die in LA. Make sure you check out To Die For, available beginning on March 26th, wherever you get your podcasts.
And when we would meet him the first time, we told him that Albert had met somebody in the Jordanian embassy, and we didn't know who. And he had been calling the Iraqi embassy in Bonn, but it wasn't clear if they had ever taken up his approaches. And so our undercover said, not to worry, I can be Jordanian or Iraqi. I'll be whatever he expects to be. And so I always say that our undercover deserves an Oscar because his performance was stellar. Albert was so desperate for money. The unit was on its way back from Desert Storm by March of 1991. So they're regaling him with some of the stories of, their wartime service, and he's got nothing to share other than he's been sitting in an office, safe in Germany. And so he's got this little secret. And we just thought the timing was right to go ahead and try to get him in touch with an undercover officer. And I will tell you, stings are always calculated gambles with a lot of unknowns. You can only go in based on the information you've gathered, the sense you've got for your suspect, and then leave it in the hands of the undercover. As I mentioned, our undercover was absolutely stellar. He got briefed by me, the lawyer, and our staff psychologist and our staff judge advocate for the 66 MI group. And the first thing he told each of us was, don't tell me too much, especially about Sombolay or the investigation, because he was going to go in as a new case officer who had just been given this case by either the Iraqis or Jordanians, whoever Albert believed him to be. And he said, I'll just go in and say, hey, look, this just happened. I'm here to look out for your interests. I want to make sure you've been recognized and paid enough. And so we're going to sit and talk, and you're going to tell me, how this all started and how much you got. And I've got some, money, and we'll see about paying you today. And so, yeah, Albert bit. there was no doubt in my mind, or by that point, Greg wasn't working with me. He was going on doing other great things, but I had two other partners, and, we're all sit around planning this. And one of them was kind of a naysayer. Oh, this will never work. And the other one's like, oh, it's worth a chance. And I'm like, well, you don't know till you try. And if he says no, then we'll just arrest him and charge him. And if he invokes his rights, then we'll just have to go with the evidence we've got. But I had a feeling that from the surveillance and from the staff psychologist, he did something I'd never heard of before, which was a remote psychological testing about Sombolay, but he gave me the tests. And this was back in February. And when his name was Herb Gupton, and he had been a counterintelligence warrant officer and then went to school and became a psychologist and was a lieutenant colonel. And he called me in and he said, Connie, I want you to do this remote psychological testing. And I said, Herb, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 batteries of tests, but I want you to take them based upon what you know about Sombolay. And I said, Herb, I've never met him. I only saw him one time when I passed him when I was in Baumholder and he was going the other way. He said, but Connie, from the records checks, from the interviews of the senior people in his unit, from the surveillance report. Trust me, you know him better than you think you do. And I said, okay. So I took these tests, and he said, come back in a couple of days. And he gave me what he called an executive summary. And he said, I want you to read this. So I did. And I looked up and I said, well, Herb, if this is accurate, it's really going to help us later when we arrest him. And it'll help my team now who's, doing the surveillance. He said, absolutely. And I want you to take this, share it with your surveillance team, with the other agents who are helping you on the investigation. And once he is arrested, and he said, I'm sure you'll arrest him and I'm sure he'll be successfully prosecuted, then I'm going to give him these tests, and he will take them along with some other psychological inventories. And I guarantee you, this 3 or 4 page document will be an executive summary of how he sees himself. I was like, okay. And that executive summary said that he distorted reality, that he lies frequently, and was loyal only to himself. That was in February. Fast forward to July, after he's sentenced and he's sitting in Mannheim and we're starting our debriefing. We asked him if he would agree to psychological test, and he said sure. So Herb spent, 8 or 10 hours over a course of a couple of days, just the two of them. And then he produced something like a 10 or 11 page report. And as my partner and I are reading this, we're like, oh my gosh, you're right. That February report is an executive summary of the way he saw himself. So that was a tool I'd never heard of before. And I hope they're still using it today, because it really did help us understand who he was. And yeah, so the psychologist briefed our undercover. The lawyer did. There were never going to be any entrapment issues because he had already showed a predisposition for this behavior. It's not like if you took me and through some undercover officer pretending to be from, Russia or China or Iran and tried to recruit me. And I go, what the heck are you talking about? Get out of here and I'll go report you, Well, we didn't expect that obviously to happen, but the lawyer still wanted to just give him a little bit of a roadmap. And then, like I said, the psychologist gave him some insights, and I just briefed him as much as he wanted. And then the undercover called Albert at his office that afternoon. I had arranged with Captain Flood to keep Albert on duty until 5 o'clock. It was Good Friday. Long about 4:30, I guess or 4:15, something like that. Our undercover calls the CQ number, the charge of quarters number at the unit, and asks to speak to Sombolay. Sombolay comes to the phone, and I'm sitting there, and this is all being recorded. And the undercover right away speaks some Arabic, and it became very clear that Albert didn't understand it. And that was our test to see if he spoke Arabic, since we'd been told he might speak Arabic, but he didn't. So our undercover switched to English. And he said, I'm here to meet with you, and I want to meet you today. Can you meet me behind McDonald's at 5 o'clock? And Albert right away says, are you kidding? And the undercover was, like I said, Oscar performance. He says, why? Did we kid with you before? And was kind of stern about it. And Albert, no, I'll be there. I'll be there. And so he said, okay, don't tell anybody. And if you've got anything, bring it with me. And so the conversation ends. I go to the Sting Hotel site because we've got a command center set up there. And then our undercover meets Albert behind McDonald's. Albert gets in the car. And unfortunately, as Forrest Gump says, it happens. And the technical equipment that would have recorded with a video in the car failed, but our undercover was wearing a wire as a backup. So for the 20-minute drive to the hotel site, we don't know what's going on. Physical surveillance is following them, calling out where they are. Our tech team is still in the hotel room, setting up the equipment there. And once they're finished, our undercover, I have to keep thinking not to call him by name, our undercover gets Albert into the hotel room, and he knows we haven't heard anything for the last 20 minutes. And so he sits down, and now it's being recorded live, and I'm sitting on headphones watching it on a TV, and our lawyer's sitting on headphones watching it on TV. And the first thing the undercover says is, okay, we're going to go back through what you were telling me in the car, because I've got to make notes. I couldn't do it driving. And he said, and then we're going to, go into more detail. And so they meet for about 2 hours in the actual hotel room. But that's when the undercover said, okay, you thought at first I was Nabil from Brussels. And that's the first time we got a name on the Jordanian out of Brussels, was first name Nabil. And Albert said, yeah, in fact, I thought you were him. You look so much like him and you act like him. And then I realized you're not. And our undercover had given him some other Arabic name. But from that point on, we knew then that Albert had expected the Jordanians and not the Iraqis to contact him. And our undercover went with it. During the sting operation, he got all the who, what, when, where, whys. And I tell you, it doesn't get any better than when your suspect, and this is a quote, says, it's a dangerous thing. If they catch me, I'm good for that day. It's treason. It's treason. They trusted me. And I knew at that point that this guy is going to go to, prison. Well, as the debriefing is going on and our undercover's making all these notes, he gets to the appropriate point in the meeting and he says, I need that you'll write a statement that you're going to work for me. And that's basically all he said to Albert. And Albert says, well, how do you want me to title this? The undercover said, to the Royal Jordanian government, if you want, you know what to write. And that's exactly what he said. You know what to write. And then Albert sits there and writes and writes and writes. And the lawyer and I are looking at each other. My boss, Maceo Boston, the two tech guys, Herb Gupton, and Judge Rhodes. We called him Judge because he was a military lawyer who'd been a judge at one time. But our staff lawyer, we're all in this small hotel room with me. And they can't hear or anything, but they can see it on the TV screen. And in the background, we hear him saying, well, what's he doing? You can see what we can see. He's writing and he's writing and he's writing. And then Albert decided to read the work agreement aloud. And at that point, between saying it was treason and he was good for that day, we were sure he would be found guilty based on the evidence. And I've got a copy of it, and I'll read it to you. It says, quote, and remember, none of this is dictated. Not one word of it is given to Albert other than when he asked, how do I title this? And the undercover said, to the Royal Jordanian government if you want. It doesn't really matter. So on his own volition, he writes, quote, I hereby engage myself to truly and loyally work for the Royal Jordanian government by furnishing them with any piece of information or material I may get from the U.S. Army. I request that any such secret information must be kept only between me and the RJG representative. My protection from the U.S. government agents must be secured and any financial support provided. With all my trust and confidence, I will remain faithful to this agreement. Albert T. Sombolay, March 29th, 1991. Yeah. Can you imagine? I know when I went through case officer school and we were taught about getting a work agreement because it's a psychological tool. It could be as simple as I'm a friend of Jordan, and he could have signed it John Jones. He would have known what a friend of Jordan meant and that he was John Jones. And usually most spies are going to write something not as revealing as this one. So I always say this is going to go down in the annals of case officer history because I don't know of another spy who's ever written this kind of work agreement before.
Right.
But
right.
yeah. So, and then the undercover later will ask him for a written account of what he gave to Nabil in Jordan. And so he says he got about 1,700 marks, which was about $1,400, I guess. And he lists the type of stuff that he gave, which was the U.S. Army 7th Corps, 2nd of the 29th Field Artillery Battalion fight plan and mission in Saudi, one sample of a chemical suit, a telephone roster for the rear detachment, MBC, and he spells out nuclear, biological, chemical detection kit, NBC decontamination kit, and 3 samples of meals ready to eat. And he signs and dates that one the 29th of March. And then our undercover, we gave him, I think it was 3,500 marks. And he asked Albert, he says, well, what do you think this is worth and in the future? And he says, well, I could stand for 5,000 marks. Well, we had asked for 5,000, but our money custodian wouldn't give it to us. They said, oh, that's too much. So we had 3,500. So our undercover pulls out a wad of marks and he counts out, 3,000. And you can just see Albert's whole demeanor changed at that point. He, is just elated, but he also realized he had not gotten the full amount. And our undercover put the rest of it in his pocket. And then the meeting starts to end. And before it did, Albert said that he had a bag of stuff at his home. It's too bad he hadn't got more notice or he would have brought it. Well, we had not planned for a second meeting. And the plan was for the undercover to drive him back to his car in Baumholder behind McDonald's. Albert, we had military police around to make sure he went back home. And if he tried to go to Brussels, he was going to be, stopped on the highway and arrested. But he drove back home. Well, this was something we had to get approved because a lot of people don't know, but sting operations have to be signed off by the Secretary of the Army. That's how high up this approval had to go. Well, we didn't plan for this, so we're making phone calls out of the command little hotel room back to my control office in Munich and saying, hey, look, he says he's got a bag of stuff. We want to have a second meeting. The lawyer says it fits the parameters, but we can't talk to our undercover because we don't have comms with him. And we got permission. And fortunately, what was supposed to happen was that once Albert went to his apartment, he would be arrested. So I called the arrest team there and said, don't arrest him. Let him go to his house. And if he comes back later and gets in a car, physical surveillance will follow him wherever he's going. And one of my colleagues says, well, what are you doing? I said, look, you're not here. This is hot pursuit, heat of the moment, whatever I use. I said, just back off and do what I say. we're just making this up as we go along, right? And so, okay. So they stand off. He does go home. Surveillance was in an observation post across the street. They see him go into his apartment. Well, in the interim, I'm calling the MP station and I get our undercover on the phone. And our initial plan had been that once Albert was arrested and he was taken to the MP station there on base, they would bring our undercover out in handcuffs, pretend that they had arrested him, and he would be going off in, angry Arabic, and they would push him into a room and shut the door. And we hope that would make Albert want to talk to us. Well, now we're interrupting that flow of the plan. So I get our undercover on the phone. I say, hey, look, we want you to call him at his home, arrange a second meeting. He said, oh, good. I really wanted to do that, but we hadn't discussed it. And so I wasn't sure if I could. Then I said, well, the lawyer says you can. He's at home. So when you hang up with me, call him back and tell him you talked to headquarters and they want that bag of stuff. So he did. And Albert picked up the phone and the undercover explains that. And he says, okay, I can meet you in half an hour back at McDonald's. So they go back to McDonald's the second time. He gives them a black trash bag full of all kinds of unclassified stuff, to include an old smell map, Soviet military liaison map of where the Soviets could and could not go. That was in there, among other things. And he gets the last 500 marks and signs another receipt. And then Albert goes through drive-through, gets him some fries, drives back to his house. And when he gets out of the car, the MPs and our counterintelligence agents surround the car and the fries fall on the ground and he's arrested and brought to the MP station. And when he gets there, our undercover is in handcuffs going off in angry Arabic. They shut him, push him in another door. They bring Albert in, and the psychologist has said, just let him sit there. And we watched him through a two-way mirror. Let him stew for a while before you go in and read him his rights. And he also said, Connie, I know you're the case agent on this, but he said, given the fact that Albert is from Zaire and his culture, he might be more receptive to a man in an authority role and you in an administrative role. So I think you should read the rights, and one of the guys on your team should basically make the pitch about having caught the undercover officer, this, well, we call him the Jordanian, and that he had been approaching other U.S. service members. You just happened to be the unlucky guy who got caught with him. We've got him over there. He's cooperating. We need your side of the story. And anyway, this is all, again, kind of spur of the moment because the staff psychologist had not thought of this earlier. And I said, hey, I don't have to do anything. You want two guys to go in there. It's whoever gets the job done, because we've got to look at who the suspect is, not who, we are. And he said, no, I think if you take the role of the administrative person who will read the rights after Marty Hare was the special agent who talked to him for like 10 or 12 minutes. And again, you can do that as long as you don't ask questions, right? Before you read him the rights. And so Marty did an absolutely amazing extemporaneous job of trying to explain to Albert why it would be in his best interest to cooperate. And then he turns it over to me. And of course, as soon as I start reading his rights. He says, I want a lawyer. So everything stopped at that point. But yeah, so there were a couple things we didn't expect, but we were able to push through them, and I think it came from good teamwork and understanding, and that psychological assessment, and understanding that Albert was desperate, and that it would basically fall for this. So, and a lot of people have said, well, it's just because he was so desperate, for money. But when I look at some of the sting operations that the military and the FBI have conducted over the years, it's worked on all kinds of people, whether they had top secret, special compartmented information access, whether they were in the Army, the Navy, the FBI, whether, I don't know, I can't think if we've stung anybody in the CIA, but we've got a real rich history in the military of doing it, So yeah, it works, and everybody's susceptible to, one, not wanting it to stop, and two, even if they don't need the money, they need the attention, because they've got a secret they can't really share with anybody else, and you've now introduced somebody they can talk to.
Yeah, that's a very unique aspect of that whole story, and I bet it's played out in a lot of different cases all over the world, where that case officer is, using you, obviously, but at the same time, you start to feel like they're your only friend. I bet that's happened on many occasions.
Oh yeah, yeah, and there's one legend in the FBI. He's retired now, and I hope he hasn't passed, but he was really active during the Cold War. But the Army used him in the James Hall case. The George Trofimov case was another Army case. Those are just two I can think of off the top of my head right now. I've got my PowerPoint up, but unfortunately, the slide with all my stings on it isn't in this particular presentation. But an FBI agent by the name of Earl Pitts, who worked Soviet counterespionage and was spying for the Soviets, he fell for a sting operation that went on for 18 months before he was arrested, or 16 or 18 months before he was arrested. And you would think an FBI counterintelligence specialist would have, I don't know, his antenna up or something, but
Right.
it went on for, I think it was 16 months. Yeah. So yeah, it's an amazing technique, and it really works.
hmm It's amazing stuff. So I have a lot of thoughts, honestly, about Sombolay already. I want to go back to you when you
Okay.
were in the hotel command center, like you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, and you're watching this all play out. You're watching it live, I take it, right? Like you have a live feed
Yes.
into the room. Was it? I
Yes.
mean, it just. I have to imagine it was like electrifying to see everything going exactly as well as it could possibly have gone.
Oh, Justin, it was insane. In fact, there's a picture of me somewhere, and I haven't found it yet, of me kind of pumping my fist in the air. And one of the tech guys took it, and that was when Albert was reading his work agreement aloud. And again, they couldn't hear it, but the judge and I could hear it. When I teach this class, I tell people it was exciting when he said he knew it was treason. If he got caught, he was good for that day. But boy, when he read that work agreement aloud, I thought I was going to pee my pants. It was just like, oh my
Oh
God,
my
I can't
gosh!
believe
Yeah.
this is actually happening in front of my eyes, And my role, and the reason I was listening to it, was I had to keep count of the VCR and make note of key phrases or words at the counter on the VCR recorder, so that if the defense ever challenged the veracity of the tape or wanted to say we edited or something, there would be a log that would correspond throughout the almost 2 hours, so
Oh
that
wow.
we could prove it had never been tampered with. And something else that was kind of interesting was going back to that distorting reality. We would learn during the debriefing that Albert did not believe the civilian lawyer he hired or the military lawyer that was assigned to his defense when they said that this was a sting operation, and that the undercover was not really a Jordanian. He was an army officer who, basically did this kind of thing for a living. And he told his law, and he told Mason, me, and probably Mike and me, and whoever else helped debrief him over the course from July till October. Initially, he would tell them, no, you're wrong. He was my Arab. And it was not until he got a transcript of because the prosecution had to make a verbatim transcript. And he said his lawyer gave it to him, and he started reading it. And he said, I looked up at, can't remember his lawyer's name, but whoever it was, he said, I looked up at him and said, this is exactly what I said. And the two lawyers said, Albert, we've been telling you since March that this was an undercover army operation. He wasn't really an Arab spy. He was working for the US government. So, yeah, until he saw that, he really did not want to believe it. And as I mentioned, he had his wife filed for the 3,000 or 3,500 marks, whatever it was, from us because he considered that his money and that we took it. And yeah, so it goes back to that distortion of reality. So there are a lot of ups and downs with this one.
Hmm. Incredible, incredible. So the undercover officer that you mentioned, you said did this for a living. Do you mean to say that he did a lot of undercover work, or he was just that good at what he was doing in this particular case?
No, what he did for a living was recruit spies to work for the US Army.
Okay,
He had never worked a sting operation before,
gotcha.
but his job was a case officer. So he just approached it as, instead of I'm an Army case officer, I'm a Jordanian case officer, and conducted it just like he would
Oh,
any
okay,
other sort of meeting. Yeah.
okay. That makes a lot of sense. Actually, the way could just switch it around in his mind, I suppose, and
Uh-huh.
just be naturally ready for it based on his previous experience. Because I
Yep.
was going to ask if he had to do a huge amount of preparation, like creating a fictional backstory, that kind of thing, or if he was just, a natural fit that could kind of wing it as he had these conversations.
It turned out he was a natural fit because one of the things, we didn't know how we were going to get false documents for him either being Jordanian or Iraqi. And he said, you know what? Don't worry about it. I'm not going to take any sort of documentation. And he had a rental car. He said, I'm not even going to take the rental car agreement. And if Sombolay asks him for his name or sort of credentials or identification or whatever, the undercover said, I'm just going to handle it as, hey, I'm in a hostile environment. I don't carry anything in case I
Hmm.
get stopped. It's for your protection and my protection. And we would not know it until after the sting is over. And I was talking to the undercover. I said, at what point did Albert ask you your name? He said, he never asked me for identification.
Oh my
He
gosh,
never asked my name. He never asked where we were going when we got in the car and I drove him 20 minutes to the hotel. He just got in there and started talking. So, yeah, but he could have winged, believe me, he could have winged it and pulled it off. He's that good.
fantastic. That's another thing about Sambalai that it has me scratching my head. Honestly, is that, as you said, he's a guy that walks around just committing one type of crime or another every day. It seems like, but he has such terrible instincts for everything, like no sense of self-preservation. It seems like just kind of blindly stumbling through all of this and making every mistake under the book, which benefits your investigation. But I can't
But
believe he wasn't already in jail for something else before any of this even
well,
started. Honestly.
I can't either, especially when it came to like the bad check writing and he got busted from
Hmm.
E5D4 and there was no, confinement. It was just a financial burden on him. But when we were talking to the sergeant major of his unit that first day, he had been Albert's first sergeant before he moved up to the battalion. And he was incredulous, and Greg and I are sitting there explaining what's going on, and I'll never forget this man saying, if you had told me that you were investigating him for rape or robbery, I could see that, but not
Hmm.
espionage. And that's always struck me, that it's easier to think of somebody committing any other crime than betraying your nation.
Hmm.
you know yeah, so, and I've never forgotten that, you know just
Yeah, that
that
is an
kind of
interesting insight.
take on it. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. 'Cause we don't want to believe that one of our own would do this.
Right. Right. Absolutely. So you said earlier he was sentenced to 34 years. Do you know how many he ultimately served of that?
As far as I know, I think it's 2/3 in the military, and I will tell you, he never passed. And I mentioned this earlier. He never passed a polygraph. So could we have said he's broken his deal, and the 34 years would have kicked in? Yes, but one of the problems with the plea agreement, and we had given the prosecutors the plea agreement from Warrant Officer James Hall's case. He was a spy for the East Germans and the Soviet Union, and he would later get 40 years in a court martial. But the plea agreement was counterintelligence debriefing verified by a polygraph. Well, the legal clerk who typed up Sombolay's plea agreement left out that critical word, or two words, verified by, and just put in that he would agree to take polygraphs. So I went back to the lawyers and I said, look, he can't pass a polygraph. And they looked at the legal stuff and they said, oh, well, as long as he still agrees to take one, he's not breaking his deal.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, that small of a thing, you know,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
because I would love to have kicked it up to 34 years, but we couldn't, because he didn't refuse to take them. He just couldn't pass them. So, because he's
Sure.
always lying about stuff. And he would say, that's my story unless you show me otherwise. And of course we couldn't show him otherwise, and
Amazing.
as I mentioned, he was really angry that he didn't get to see any evidence against him. So I was going to say, at one point, one of the people that was debriefing him with me said, you are the evidence. Remember, you saw the transcript, you've got the videotape. That's that's the evidence of what you did.
Hmm.
You confessed for over 2 hours, between the car and the meeting. So yeah.
So, Connie, have you like looked him up at all since any of this happened, and search him up on Google or anything?
No, I don't know. But Gina did, because she was going to use him in some talk she was giving, and she asked me for some of my slides. Well, she got on and found that he had a Facebook page, and
Hmm.
most of it was in French. And he's obviously now in his 70s. And there was a posting, and she sent me a picture of it. And this just still pisses me off to this day. This man, J.M. Lilachat, says, thank you for your service, Papa Albert Sombolay. Happy Veterans Day. We honor who served before us and keep those who are serving today in prayer. May the Almighty God bless America. And all I could
Right.
think is, this man served, I don't know, what, 2/3 of 19, 12 years or something, 11
Hmm.
years, something like that. And then he's released, and then he goes back to, I think he was in Ohio, but he's still obviously not told anybody where he was for those missing 11 or 12 years of his life, when he was sitting in Leavenworth confinement facility.
Oh
And
my
here's
gosh.
somebody thanking him for his service. So yeah, kind of amazing. But she said almost everything else was in French, and it looked like his wife Norma had divorced him. And I'll never forget, one team of our investigators had interviewed her the night Sombolay was arrested, and she had no idea any of this was going on. And then they didn't have her sign the sworn statement there. They wanted to bring it back and type it up. And that was one of the lessons learned, was that get a statement at the time in handwriting and have it executed then. Don't bring it back and make it look, pretty. Well, the next day I took it back along with somebody else and said, Miss Sombolay, here's your statement. We typed it up for you. She read it, and she says, I'm not signing that. So, and the night before, if she had written, she would have signed it. But I asked her how she felt about her husband being arrested for espionage. And she was kind of incredulous, but I'll never forget, she said, he's not much, but he's all I've got. And
Oh man.
that's how dependent she was on this man. And through physical surveillance, they had seen, she was at home. One of her parents were ill in February. And that first weekend of physical surveillance, they saw Albert and a woman that was not his wife go in and out of his quarters, and even go into the PX and that type of thing. So I think that's what she was talking about. Was
Oh
it?
gosh.
Yeah. So yeah, this man
Wow.
had a lot of layers.
Yeah, one after the other, just continually worse. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing a redeeming side to him yet.
Yep.
So yeah, that was something I had noticed when I looked him up on Facebook a while back. Is that he likes to change his profile photo every once in a while to an old uniform picture of himself. So, and every single time people are like, "Oh, look at you, you're so handsome," and that kind of typical hype kind of stuff, and it's
Yep.
horribly embarrassing. I have to assume that none of them know anything, but he's also remarkably unashamed. Is the
Yeah.
impression I get from somebody who would do that. There's another article that he was interviewed for several years ago. I don't recall when exactly, but just like a local article in his hometown in the past 5 years. And he claimed in that article that while he was still in Zaire, Muhammad Ali came for, I guess it was Rumble in the Jungle, and he was
Uh-huh.
Muhammad Ali's English translator during his visit to the country. And because he's a perpetual liar, I have to assume that that's not true.
I would assume that too, but who knows? Maybe that didn't come out in our debriefings for sure. But I was just thinking, if you do that Facebook thing, you could just put a post. Well, how do you explain being arrested on the 29th of March of 1991 for espionage and being convicted on the 17th of July and spending, the next 11 years in Leavenworth, question mark. But I don't do any social media, so I wouldn't know, that that could come back and bite you. But I will tell you, when I was working for David back, let's see, I started in 99. It was probably around 2002 or 3. One of the admin people in my office gave me a phone note, and he said, this man called claiming to be a landlord, wanting to know if Sombolay had been arrested and went to prison. And there was a phone number for me to call. And I was like, and our employee's name was Frank. I was like, when did this come in? He said, well, yesterday afternoon after you had left. So I gave it to you this morning. And I carried it around all day thinking, do I call or not? And I was like, you know what? I just shredded it. I don't want anything to do with him. But I don't know if it was him or truly a landlord, but it just seemed really suspicious to me, and there's no reason for me to have contact with him. So that's the only time there's been any sort of overture toward me from either him or somebody in his orbit.
Yeah, I don't blame you at all for leaving that in the past. He doesn't deserve any kind of goodwill or anything. I don't think either.
No.
So he got what he deserved, as a matter of fact.
Oh, absolutely.
Incredible.
Absolutely.
Well, Connie, this is an incredible case. Honestly, I mean, it sounds like a tremendously memorable one for you as well. And you had Germany in the 1980s doing counterintelligence work. I can only imagine how busy that you must have been. Honestly, from all the stories that I've dug up from that time period.
Oh, we knew what we were doing during the Cold War for sure. We knew who our enemy was.
Right.
Yeah.
Somewhat simpler times, I suppose.
And probably in some ways, yes. I've been retired now over 24 and a half years, so longer than I actually served, which is really hard to believe.
Oh gosh.
I just look in the mirror and I'm like, I still feel 18 inside, not 68 on the outside, but come November will be my anniversary, 50 years from enlisting. And it's like, how could that have been? And I think in terms of, oh my gosh, then that means a whole generation of soldiers have already served and retired since I've retired. And now new soldiers are working on theirs, So yeah, it's hard to think in those terms, but I had not heard of podcast until you reached out to me. And I just wanted to thank you for what you're doing. I looked at some of the guests you've had on there. It's just a plethora of different cases and very experienced people throughout the U.S. government. And I appreciate you kind of doing this oral history. And there's a quote I want to kind of close with, and it's from a book called Spycatcher by a former MI5, which is the British equivalent of the FBI, named Peter Wright. And in it, he writes, an intelligence service, particularly a counterespionage service, depends on its memory and sense of history. Without them, it is lost. And you are helping to keep our memory and sense of history alive. And I will tell you, we always draw back on other cases when we're running a current case, because with the running the sting operation, there was no doctrine. I was fortunate that my boss had worked technical surveillance on the James Hall case. One of the desk officers had been a special agent on a sting. And so between the two of them, I sat down, picked their brain, and we crafted our sting operation. But nothing had been memorialized. And I think things like your initiative really helped to do that. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Connie. You made my day. Honestly, I appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. This is a tremendously fascinating niche of history, as you know better than anybody does. And I've been very fortunate that so many people who have been involved in some really exciting and formative events are willing to talk to me about it afterwards. So it's a lot of fun, and I plan to do it for as long as I possibly can.
Oh, good. Well, I've got some leads for you.
Wonderful. Thank you. So are you still with CICT right now? Is that what you're doing at the moment, or are you retired again from there?
No, I still teach for them. In fact, on Friday, today's Tuesday. Thursday, I teach a course for the government called Virtual Spy Tour of Washington, D.C. and Baltimore metro areas. And then on the 28th, I've got an 8-hour online class, which for me starts at 4:30 in the morning because my client's in Maryland. But it's an 8-hour class on counterintelligence tradecraft adopted to counterterrorism operations. I pioneered, and as far as I know, I'm the only person who's teaching a course on the role of African Americans in intelligence operations. And then I've got another one, again, pioneering the role of women in intelligence operations. Years ago, I focused just on women in espionage, but as I was researching them, I realized that they're women in, SIG, imagery intelligence, support roles, physical surveillance, all of these different things that we needed to look beyond just spies and talk about all these different roles. So I go back from ancient times to the present day in that one. And those are just some of the courses I teach, like, I don't know, probably 20 or 30 different classes, just depending on what the client wants. And probably one of the most significant things I've done since I retired, besides still helping to educate our U.S. intelligence workforce, was nominating Harriet Tubman for the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame at Fort Huachuca. They started back when the MI Corps was founded in the 80s of honoring people for significant contributions. And so I learned about Harriet Tubman from one of my former students, then a staff sergeant named Tracy Goodwin. She's now a Chief Warrant Officer 5, and she's at the G2 in charge of the counterintelligence section at the Pentagon. But back then she was an E6 and one of my students, and they had to do a research project, and she chose to do one on women in espionage. And that's the first time I'd ever known that Harriet Tubman had anything to do with espionage. And so that piqued my interest while I was on active duty. And then after I retired, I started, researching other women. But Harriet Tubman was actually inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame in June of 2021 or 2022 now. I forget which one, but I'm so pleased that she's in there, because for me, she's the icon of a woman in intelligence. So
Wow, that's fantastic.
yeah. So, and you can find on the MI Hall of Fame website down at Fort Huachuca all kinds of different people. But I was really thrilled, and I got to meet her third great grandniece, Tina Wyatt, who accepted all the recognition and the certificates from the general when she was inducted into the Hall of Fame. So that was pretty cool to touch that part of history.
I'll bet. That's amazing stuff.
Yeah.
So, Connie, you mentioned earlier that you don't have any social media or anything. Is there anywhere people can get a hold of you if they'd like to talk to you or want to take one of your courses or something like that?
They can go to our website, ctcitraining.org, and they'll see all the different courses we teach. We do it for private industry, not just the U.S. government or the intelligence community. They can contact me through my website. There's a way to contact, and then somebody on the website would send it to me.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah,
we will encourage anybody. Yeah, absolutely. And, glad to answer any questions or help in any way, whatever.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I really appreciate your time, Connie. This is fascinating. And I know your classes must be great as well, because you're a great presenter, honestly, a great storyteller.
Oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate that, Justin. And thanks so much again for inviting me and the important work you're doing for our oral history of our intelligence community.
Well, thank you again. Take care.
Okay. Bye. Thanks, Justin.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.